Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to explore the ideas of a major figure from the 18th century who still has a big impact today, Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for this conversation, we've got some really interesting excerpts that go through his life and his major works.
Right.
We'll touch on everything from his famous quote, "Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains," which is from his Discourse on the Sciences and the Arts, to the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, the Social Contract, Emile, or on education, and even his Confessions, a real journey through the mind of this fascinating thinker.
Yeah, a lot to cover.
So our mission today is to really dig into Rousseau's central arguments about freedom, society, and human nature. And of course, to understand why his ideas still resonate so much today.
Right.
You put together some really amazing material for us. Get ready for some big aha moments as we try to figure out the seeming contradictions in his thinking about freedom within society.
Okay, let's start at the beginning with Rousseau's biography. Born in Geneva in 1712, his life begins in kind of a dramatic way. He never knew his mother, who died soon after childbirth, and he even describes his birth as the first of his misfortunes, as if he came into the world carrying the seeds of illness.
Oh, wow. So starting life with that perspective
Yeah.
and that intense relationship with his family seems to have been a strong driving force in his life. His father, a watchmaker, was devastated by the loss of his wife. And Rousseau himself felt this shadow as if he had taken his mother from his father, a constant atmosphere of mourning mixed with a certain affection. Very complex.
Definitely, and this emotional intensity seems to have been a characteristic of the family. There was his older brother who, according to accounts, simply disappeared into the world, a family nucleus that was quite, let's say, turbulent.
Right. Geneva at that time was a small Protestant republic, and its citizens were seen as upright and democratic people. Rousseau's father was very proud of the city, even comparing it to Sparta in ancient Rome. And those readings he shared with his son after dinner seem to have been fundamental in igniting his passion for knowledge. It's a lovely scene to imagine the two of them there late into the night, immersed in books.
For sure.
Yeah.
And he also grew up as the center of attention in a predominantly female environment. The nanny, the aunt. He was absorbing it all. Music, for example, came into his life early on through the songs of his aunt, and he describes himself as having a heart that was both very proud and very tender, a feminine but indomitable character, full of internal contradictions. This self-perception already gives us a taste of the complexity of his thought.
Right. And then his life takes an unexpected turn when his father is expelled from Geneva after that fight and duel. Rousseau, still a child, ends up in the care of other relatives and goes through some tough times with humiliations and even beatings. And the most surprising thing is that he associates these punishments with a kind of early sexual pleasure,
Oh, wow.
a very disturbing thing that he reports.
Yeah, it's a little disturbing, that's for sure.
Right.
It seems this experience with beatings left a deep mark on his sexuality, as he himself admits. And at 13, working as an apprentice to an engraver in Geneva, he already feels the weight of the city's Puritan atmosphere. He says that his character was almost entirely shaped by his emotions, with reason having little influence. This internal tension between reason and emotion is an essential key to understanding his philosophy.
Right. And his escape from Geneva at the age of 15 to Savoy, where he meets Madame de Wannes, or Maman, is another turning point. She converts him to Catholicism, becomes his mentor, and later on his lover. This transformation from a rather awkward boy into a more presentable young man is interesting, but his explosive temperament, it seems, never completely disappeared.
Absolutely. And he himself acknowledges that even working as an administrator for Maman and later as a teacher, he didn't feel comfortable. Paris then emerges as a new horizon at the age of 30 in search of recognition. But his arrival is not exactly triumphant, and his brief stint as secretary to the French ambassador in Venice is a disaster, but crucial for him to observe the dynamics of politics up close and to become enchanted with Italian music and the sensuality of Venetian women.
That encounter with Zulietta is almost a tragic comedy, right? He's all idealistic about the situation, and suddenly his insecurities and criticisms come to the surface, culminating in the girl's rather uninspiring advice.
Yeah, it didn't really go his way.
And this experience in Venice really seems to have opened his eyes to the influence of politics on everything.
No doubt. And his return to Paris, life in humble conditions, and his relationship with Thérèse Levasseur, an illiterate maid, mark a new phase, a complex and lasting relationship despite the odds. And the decision to give up the 5 children they had to an orphanage soon after birth is a very controversial point in his biography, and the justifications he tries to give always sound insufficient.
Yes, this issue of the children is always a delicate point when discussing Rousseau. And during this time in Paris, he begins to circulate among the intellectual circle of Les Philosophes and contributes to the encyclopedia mainly in the area of music. His friendship with Diderot seems to have been very important during this phase.
Right.
Yeah.
And it is precisely during a visit to Diderot, who was imprisoned in Vincennes, that Rousseau has that famous epiphany while reading the question posed by the Academy of Dijon. Has the progress of the arts and sciences done more to corrupt or to purify morals? This moment is considered by many to be the birth of Romanticism.
That description of the Enlightenment on the road to Vincennes is impressive. A torrent of ideas, an overwhelming feeling. It seems to have been a truly transformative experience for him, and this reaction against the rationalism of the Enlightenment, this emphasis on emotions, marks a turning point in Western thought.
Exactly. Rousseau argues that humanity was naturally good but corrupted by civilization and culture. He compares the simplicity of Sparta to the decadence of Athens, seeing the arts, letters, and sciences as garlands of flowers that conceal iron chains.
Wow.
A very strong critique of the idea of progress at the time. The big takeaway in the first discourse is this: the very things we consider signs of advancement, arts and sciences, are in fact the chains that bind our natural goodness.
And the first discourse causes quite a stir, uniting conservatives and progressives against him, despite Diderot's support. And he ends up winning the prize from the Academy of Dijon, which brings him fame, but also a deep unease with Parisian society, which he saw as corrupting. He kind of embraces this image of being a temperamental fellow.
Right, and this newfound fame doesn't stop him from stirring things up. The opera Le Devin du Village is a success, even being performed for Louis XV, but he refuses a lifetime pension, claiming that this would threaten his freedom, a very peculiar attitude and very consistent with his philosophy.
And the Lettres sur la musique française, defending the superiority of Italian music, is another romantic manifesto in the arts. It causes outrage with people burning effigies of him in public squares, but as you said, he was way ahead of his time.
Right.
Yeah.
Moving on to 1753, the Academy of Dijon poses another very provocative question. What is the origin of inequality among men, and is it authorized by natural law? Rousseau's response, the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, published in 1754, is considered one of the intellectual pillars that paved the way for the French Revolution.
In this second discourse, he delves deeper into the idea of the intrinsic goodness of human beings, now placing property as the main corrupting force, and not just the arts and sciences. He argues that we humans are unique because we build our own history and therefore are responsible for our condition.
Right.
And this social corruption has made us unhappy and unequal. He clearly distinguishes between two types of inequality: natural, based on physical differences, and social, which emerges from society and human actions.
Exactly. And he develops a hypothetical reconstruction of the social evolution of humanity, a kind of proto-psychosociology contrasting with Hobbes's dark view of a brutal state of nature. For Rousseau, the individual in his natural state was good and incorruptible. Vices arose with society. He describes the origin of society as a kind of fraud. The first person who fenced off a piece of land and declared, "This is mine," was the true founder of civil society and all its ills. That striking phrase, "You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong to all and the earth itself to no one," is a powerful warning against inequality.
And he criticizes those who rush to accept this new order, deluded by the promises of political institutions, without perceiving the dangers that lay ahead. He even recognizes that an emerging society was a kind of golden age, where families live in harmony. But the capacity for admiration soon gave way to envy, comparison, and the first steps towards inequality. The desire for public recognition began to emerge, and those with specific skills became more valued.
Right.
Private property then consolidated these inequalities, and laws and governments were created to protect it, benefiting the rich and generating envy, fear, and hatred. Life in society forces individuals to live outside themselves, depending on the opinions of others, which leads to a certain inauthenticity. Think about how we often shape our image on social media. It's a modern manifestation of this search for external validation that Rousseau already identified centuries ago.
For sure. Interestingly, the second discourse is dedicated to the Republic of Geneva, which he praises as a model of balance between natural and instituted inequality. But this view contrasts sharply with the later criticism he makes of the Geneva of his time, calling it a dictatorship.
Right.
And his return to Geneva, his readmission to Calvinism after his fame in Paris, demonstrates this search for acceptance in his homeland, despite all his criticisms.
Yes, and his decision to abandon opera, seeing it as a corrupting influence, and to adopt an austere moral reform is also part of this movement to
Right.
return to his roots. But his most productive and creative period really takes place during his stay in Montmorency, where he writes The Social Contract.
Right. The opening sentence of the social contract is one of those that echoes through history. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. For Rousseau, freedom is a fundamental right of humanity, and he argues that through a genuine social contract, individuals give up part of their individual power, but in return receive political freedom, a form of freedom superior to natural freedom. He presents himself as a sovereign citizen of Geneva with the right to discuss justice.
Right.
And the central idea is that a just society cannot be imposed by force, but must arise from the unanimous consent of its members. Citizens find true freedom by submitting to the laws they themselves create for the common good. It is here that he introduces the concept of the general will, not just the sum of individual desires, but a collective understanding of what is best for the community as a whole, even if individuals disagree. This general will guarantees freedom, equality, and promotes fraternity.
This idea of the general will is powerful, but it also raises some very complex questions, right? When he states that those who oppose the general will can be forced to be free, it leaves room for very dangerous interpretations, as history has shown us with totalitarian regimes in the 20th century.
No doubt. It's a very delicate point. Rousseau revisits the very notion of freedom, arguing that in the state of nature, human beings are slaves to their passions and limited by natural inequalities. Society, on the contrary, liberates them and provides moral equality. He recognizes the inherent tension between freedom and equality, arguing that while property is the basis of the social contract, there should be limits to wealth and poverty in order to prevent tyranny. The law should aim to preserve equality against the forces of circumstance. He also makes a crucial distinction between real law, which often only preserves the injustices of existing society, and true law, which emanates from the general will and guarantees justice. And he recognizes that people do not always understand what is best for themselves, which leads to the need for a wise legislator who could even claim divine inspiration to enact just laws. And the issue of religion also comes into play, with him advocating for a civil religion as an important element to encourage courage and patriotism in a republic.
Yes, this idea of a civil religion is quite controversial, with the potential to be manipulated. But Rousseau believed that a good republican government needed the support of religion, although he saw Christianity as more focused on spiritual values than civic virtues.
Right.
No.
Leaving aside political philosophy for a moment, Rousseau's novel Julie, or The New Heloise, achieved tremendous success, marking a crucial moment in the rise of Romanticism. This emphasis on emotional intensity in a realistic context resonated deeply with readers at the time.
Exactly. There was a significant shift towards emotional identification and the rise of more down-to-earth figures as heroes, in contrast to the distant and idealized religious or aristocratic figures. Emotions were no longer just something to be rationally defined, but were to be expressed intensely.
Right.
Yeah.
And then we have Emile, or On Education, which presents truly revolutionary ideas about childhood. Rousseau's view that children should be nurtured in their natural development and independence rather than being treated as miniature adults is the basis of our modern understanding of childhood.
No doubt. Before Rousseau, there was a very limited understanding of the specific needs of children. He emphasizes that nature wants children to be children before they are men. He sees the child initially in a state of nature without the notion of good and evil, and believes that education should encourage this nature, seeking a balance between the natural individual and the demands of the civilized human being. The goal is for the child to discover his true essence before entering the community without getting lost in it.
Right. And he even admits the use of manipulative tactics by the tutor if necessary, but vehemently opposes corporal punishment. And his view on religious education is also interesting, focused on the belief in God's love and the immortality of the soul, guided by the divine voice of the soul.
Right.
However, his views on women were remarkably traditional, seeing their main purpose as procreation and the focus of their knowledge on understanding men.
Yes, that part about women is quite jarring compared to the rest of his thinking. But Emile, despite this, generated huge controversy when it was published in 1762, mainly for its religious ideas. He was condemned by both ecclesiastical and secular authorities and had to flee, becoming a fugitive for the rest of his life.
Right. This persecution and wandering life ended up deeply affecting his mental health, leading to a state of paranoia. His brief stay in England with Hume ended in mutual accusations, and he secretly returned to France, living under the protection of some aristocrats.
And it is in this troubled period that he writes Confessions, considered by many to be his masterpiece, a deeply personal and introspective account where he seeks to make his heart transparent as crystal, a fascinating read despite his attempts to justify his own actions.
Right, and he finally married Thérèse at the age of 56 in a rather peculiar ceremony. He found solace in nature in his later years and died in 1778 with his last words expressing the belief that he would be well received by God.
And Rousseau's legacy is undeniable. 11 years after his death, the French Revolution adopted liberty, equality, fraternity as its motto, ideas deeply rooted in Rousseau's thought. His ideas inspired both the best and worst moments of political transformations in the centuries that followed.
Right.
Yep.
So for those of you who have joined us on this deep dive, the main takeaways are the central tension in Rousseau's work between the innate freedom of the human being and the chains of society, the strong critique of progress, and the emphasis on natural goodness versus social corruption, the concepts of the social contract and the general will with their potential dangers, the revolutionary view of childhood education, and Rousseau's own life full of contradictions, which leads us to question the relationship between the life of a thinker and his ideas.
And to conclude our conversation, a thought-provoking question. Rousseau posed fundamental questions about freedom, equality, and the impact of society on the individual. Reflect on his statement that the first individual who fenced off a piece of land was the founder of civil society and all its ills. How does this perspective change your view of modern social structures and the pursuit of both individual liberty and collective well-being? What aspects of natural human behavior do you believe are genuinely lost or suppressed by modern life? This is just the tip of the iceberg in exploring the complex and enduring ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was a really stimulating conversation.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And until next time.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.